Perhaps we need some outside universal threat. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
A group gathering here in Washington to talk about their UFO sightings, but this apparently is no crackpot convention. Former high-level government and military officials are among those sharing what they've seen in the skies. Our national correspondent Gary Tuchman is here. He's watching all of this unfold. So what's this conference, Gary, all about?
Well, Wolf, it's most interesting. A panel discussion within the Beltway about what might be taking place in the Milky Way and beyond. Have extraterrestrials visited us here on Earth? Well, 14 men from 7 different countries participated in a panel discussion to describe why they believe UFOs have visited Earth. And these aren't guys they just picked up off the streets. The panel includes former governor of Arizona, Fife Symington, who is one of many Arizonans who said they saw UFOs back in 1997 during an episode that is popularly referred to as the Phoenix Lights.
Major sighting here.
We want the United States government to stop perpetuating the myth that all UFOs can be explained away in down-to-earth and conventional terms. Instead, our country needs to reopen its official investigation that it shut down in 1969.
Also participating was a retired Air Force captain who says he and his passengers saw a huge flying disc. Also a retired Peruvian Air Force pilot who says he came within 300 feet of a circular UFO flying at 63,000 feet. And then there was a retired U.S. Air Force security officer who, while stationed in England, was summoned to a downed aircraft in a forest.
When we came up on the triangular-shaped craft, there were blue and yellow lights swirling around the exterior as though they were part of the surface. The air around us was electrically charged, and we could feel it on our clothes, our skin, and our hair.
Well, Peniston then says the craft took off. He never saw any beings inside or outside the UFO. He says he took pictures, but inferred they were purposely overexposed by the government.
For it, by the way, there have even been some UFO sightings reported right here in the nation's capital. There was a flurry of them back in July of 1952 when the Air Force investigated but was never able to solve or prove anything. Take a look at these headlines. Aerial, what's its buzz? D.C. again. Air Force after D.C. saucers, jets ready to chase lights, jets ordered to hunt down flying saucers. There was a lot of hype, a lot of excitement back in 1952.
But now the United Nations is getting ready for a contact with aliens from outer space. This is Moslin Othman. She's out of Malaysia. She will be planet Earth's first interstellar diplomat. And Michio Kaku is a theoretical physics professor, also host of the Science Channel series, Sci-Fi Science Physics of the Impossible, which is doing great, by the way. How are you doing, by the way?
Very good.
Nice to see you, Mitch.
Sometime later this year, maybe early next year, astronomers will announce that we have discovered Earth-like twins in outer space. And when we gaze out the night sky, somebody may be gazing back at us.
But the point that you make about these satellites in the coming year, the Kepler and is it the Karot satellite?
Yeah, the Karot satellite.
They're looking
satellite.
deep into space, right?
That's right.
They might be able to find signs of life.
That's right.
But the signs of life would be like, they'd be microbes, right?
Probably.
Michios walking around up there.
No. So far we have found 500 giant planets in outer space, but none of them are Earth-like. And that's where the Kepler, a U.S. satellite, and Corot, a French satellite, are the wild cards. Sometime later this year or next year, we expect them to announce. Astronomers will announce that we found it. The Holy Grail, an Earth-like twin in outer space. I think it's premature for us to announce our presence in outer space until we know their intentions, right? I mean, they may view us as lunch, in which case maybe it's a good idea to keep ourselves a little bit obscure.
And as someone said, if they're looking for intelligent life, they don't want to start the United Nations. That was what they said anyway. Michio, thank you. We'll see how the department does, and who knows, maybe they'll give us an interview.
On last week's broadcast, I discussed the recent claims of a group of former U.S. Air Force officers. They accused the Pentagon and the CIA of covering up evidence of extraterrestrial visits. In a press conference last week, the former officers told of witnessing incursions over U.S. military bases by unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Several of them told stories of disc-shaped flying objects directing beams of light down into U.S. missile silos. As I noted last week, all the participants agreed that the UFOs seemed interested in disabling our nuclear missiles, perhaps in an effort to keep us from destroying ourselves. If they're out there, we want very much to believe that they are nicer than we are. Also last week I told you about a report in the London Sunday Times. The Times detailed the selection of a United Nations diplomat to serve as an alien greeter and as head of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, also known as UNOOSA. The UN subsequently denied the rumors and insisted that UNOOSA has been around since 1958 and is charged with coordinating the peaceful use of outer space. But you know, the old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire, something caused more than one reputable news outlet to report that plans were underway to create a protocol for welcoming extraterrestrials to the Earth. At the time of that report, I had not yet heard of the new movie that is due to be released on November 12th. It's called Skyline. In the movie, alien spacecraft show up and shine blinding beams of blue light down to the Earth. If anybody looks up into the beam, it locks in on them, and they are drawn physically up into the spacecraft. Check out the movie's advertising poster. By the images depicted, it could just as easily be for a movie about the rapture of the church. Here's how that scene is depicted in the film. Now, why do I mention this film at this time? I believe it's part of a conditioning process to prepare the world for a great deception. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that the screenwriters and movie makers are deliberately trying to prepare the world for a great deception. What I believe is that they may be being deceived by demonic forces to write and to create what they're doing. You see, I believe that deceptions don't just come out of thin air. The Bible says there's going to be a great deception, but that deception has to be set up. Now here's a possible theory that I believe fits in with what we know from Bible prophecy. The Bible says that at a point before the onset of the tribulation, the Holy Spirit's ministry of restraining evil by indwelling through the church will come to a close. The Holy Spirit will be withdrawn together with the vessels he inhabits. This is how the Apostle Paul describes the event. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. In another passage about this same incident, Paul declares that this catching up of true believers will be done instantaneously, faster than the eye can see. Now, it's undeniable that there is developing a narrative in the media and through the world about a benevolent extraterrestrials coming to the earth to remove the obstacles to world peace and unity. You know who the world believes are the obstacles? You are the ones who object to Israel giving up land in exchange for empty promises of peace. You are the ones who believe that the United Nations can never bring about the international brotherhood of man. You are the ones who believe there can never be peace without the Prince of Peace. You're the ones who proclaim that man can never reach his full potential apart from knowing Jesus Christ personally. The world believes that there can never be peace until you either decide to go along with it or get removed. Unless, of course, the aliens come and remove all the obstacles to peace before we destroy ourselves as a race. One day, in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, according to the Scriptures, millions of people will suddenly be snatched up into the air by the Lord, precisely the way this movie poster depicts it. But billions will be left behind, and they will want to know where all the missing people went and why. The world will be desperate for an answer, since the Antichrist will not want the world to know the truth that there really is an Almighty God and that He did precisely what He promised to do. They'll need someone on whom to blame the disappearances. A demonically staged alien invasion will fit the situation perfectly. And what's more, this unprecedented phenomenon will drive the people of the world to unite into a one-world government. When the Antichrist is miraculously healed of a mortal head wound, they will rush to follow him. This new miracle-working world leader, who apparently will have the favor of the aliens, will demonstrate supernatural wisdom and deceive the whole world into following and worshiping him. And thus God's prophecy about the world being deceived would be fulfilled. And for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be condemned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Does this seem too much to believe that is happening before our eyes? I believe it's happening just as God predicted it would. You know, in a closing thought, Christians are constantly exhorted to keep looking up in expectation of the Lord's coming for them. In this new movie, Skyline, they're told, don't look up. Interesting, huh?
Is the Vatican entering the final frontier? Yeah, the Catholic Church just held a week-long conference with 30 scientists to discuss the possibility of alien life and what that might mean for faith and the church.
It's about time. Fox News contributor Father Jonathan
Clayton got
here.
to them.
And just like E.T., he phoned home. Father Jonathan phoned some sources in Rome and got all the details. Father, nice to see you this morning.
E.T. phoned Rome.
Why in the world is the Vatican seemingly in the business of trying to find E.T.?
Yeah, it sounds like a stretch, doesn't it, TJ?
Yeah.
Well, the Vatican got interested in astronomy because they had to keep the calendar, and you need astronomers to do that. And actually, for the last 100 years have been Jesuit priests doing research astronomy. So they have a tradition of being interested in astronomy. And maybe the idea of whether there's life out there, especially intelligent life, has an effect on the world's religions. So maybe they want to know the answer.
So do you get a sense from being out there, and you were at this summit, and scientists and astronomers, and you all gathered out there, but did you get a sense that maybe the Vatican wants to know before anybody else?
Well, I think science is such an open process these days that they're not going to have any privileged access to that information. I think maybe they're trying to prepare themselves because, you know, the discovery of the alien life, again, especially intelligent life, would really be pretty profound because it would affect our relationship to the rest of the universe.
Does it seem, though, and again, you all are scientists out there, I mean, sure, some of the scientists are religious folks, but for the most part, you all are out there working as scientists at the Vatican, but still, does it come up in your discussions at this conference as well, how possibly some of the findings, if you did find evidence of life out there, that could directly contradict what we know and what we think about religion?
I think there's a distinction between whether we find microbial life, like germs. You know, I was thinking about your last segment. Wouldn't it be scary if we had to deal with alien germs? So that might not threaten the world's religions. But intelligent life, most of the world's major religions have a special relationship between humans and the Creator. And if there are a bunch of other intelligent aliens out there, what does that say about that relationship?
What does that say? And some say it would change the game, essentially, in this country. I'm going to put up something here for our viewers to see. I'm going to share it with you. It comes from Gary Bates, who's the head of an Atlanta-based Creation Ministries International. His quote saying here, "My theological perspective is that terrestrial life would actually make a mockery of the very reason Christ came to die for our sins, for our redemption." Now, do you believe, you kind of hit on it there, but some validity to that statement that if you find intelligent life out there, do we almost have to start all over?
it makes you wonder whether we've just told ourselves a just-so story. Some of the major world's religions, like Buddhism, I don't think would be affected at all because they don't have such a very special story they tell about humans and their redemption.
Are UFOs involved in end-time Bible prophecy, end-time events? Could they be a little piece of a puzzle that we have missed? My guest, Chuck Missler, says yes. He's a Naval Academy graduate and former branch chief of the Department of Guided Missiles, CEO of 6 public companies. 4 of the 6 were highly classified in the Department of Defense. Chuck Missler, you are such, in my opinion, and I'm entitled to say this, you are such a renowned, wonderful Bible teacher. Are you a little missugar? What are you talking about? UFOs, flying saucers? I don't get it.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the intended encouragement, but I really came at this whole subject because of my love for the Bible. It happens that I come out of an information science background. My whole career, 30 years in the strategic community, gives me perhaps a little different perspective than most people would have going at this topic. But I want to right up front indicate it was my biblical interest that brought me into this rather than my high-tech background, although that's proven to be, that and my Department of Defense connections have been very valuable to me. So that's one of the reasons I find myself in this peculiar posture.
But it's not, in other words, he has a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge from the intelligence community, which helps him put a lot together of what we'll be talking about. But he's saying it's his love for the Bible that is really motivating him right now. So you found a controversial verse in Genesis 6, which has to do with a prophecy that Jesus said.
I start with Jesus, and in Matthew 24, he gives 4 disciples an inside briefing on a second coming. And in that briefing, he makes a very strange remark. He says, as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, many people presume he just meant that it was because of the business as usual. So anyway, the point is, we need to understand what the days of Noah were like in order to understand what he was saying. So that takes us to Genesis 6, and when you jump into Genesis 6, you quickly discover that very few seminaries teach what that passage really says. And so as you get into that Genesis 6, you have to understand the first 2 verses are one sentence, and it deals with this strange goings-on between the fallen angels producing hybrids with humans. And that was so uncomfortable in the early years of the church that it was the understanding of the early rabbis. It was also the understanding of the early church that what it was dealing with was fallen angels cohabiting with human women, producing a strange hybrid offspring. But when you get to about the 5th century, that was a very uncomfortable posture. So they cooked up this, what they call the lines of Seth argument, and that's what's taught in most seminaries. One of the things I discover is that many people who are seminary products of most seminaries haven't been taught that there are different perspectives of Genesis 6, and it's the literal careful study version of Genesis 6 that starts to raise the fog on this whole issue.
Now tell me about the word Nephilim. What does that mean?
In the Hebrew, it comes from the verb nephal. It means the fallen ones, and that's the term used. Don't confuse that with the fallen angels. The fallen angels, according to Genesis 6, cohabited with human women to produce a hybrid offspring that are called in the Hebrew the Nephilim. In the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, they use the word gigantes, which is transliterated giants, and they did happen to be giants, but that's not what the word means. The word actually means, in the Greek, the earthborn. And so, from the Greek point of view, they're earthborn. From the Hebrew point of view, they're the fallen ones. But either way, they're pointing to a hybrid, and it apparently was part of Satan's plan to contaminate the Messianic line.
So the purpose of the flood was to get rid of these.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. You study verse 9 of Genesis 6. It speaks of Noah that his genealogy was untainted, unblemished. And apparently it was a distinctive in that sense. He may not have been the only one unblemished, but the fact that he was unblemished qualified him for what God was going to do, among other things. But the point is, the whole issue that God chose to do was to save 8 people in the ark and erase the blackboard, so to speak.
Okay, but if the blackboard was erased, then we don't have to fool with them today. Okay. If they were all destroyed.
Except Genesis 6 verse 4 says there were Nephilim led in those days, comma, and also after that. We discover, many good Bible scholars miss this, that you really won't understand subsequent events in the Old Testament by not realizing it happened again. When God in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17 confirms the land covenant to Abraham, he tells Abraham that he and his descendants are going to be away for 400 years, but after 400 years, they're going to return. That gave Satan, who's obviously listening, the realization that he had 4 centuries to lay down a minefield. And that's why when Moses enters the land and he sends his at Kadesh Barnea, he sends in the 12 reconnoiters, if I can call them that. They come back and say, in Numbers 13, verse 33 says they were Nephilim in the land. So it happened again.
I'll tell you what, hold that thought. Did you know that 12 astronauts have reported UFOs? Don't go away, we'll be right. Hello, Sid Roth here with Chuck Missler. And Chuck, so many astronauts are reporting UFOs, but one was amazing. This one astronaut, John Blaha, a ham radio operator, actually picked up what he was saying. As a matter of fact, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Let's take a look at that now.
The wording is as follows. Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under observance.
I have a question for you. Why is there so much misinformation? Why are there so many cover-ups? I mean, when astronauts are reporting UFOs, what is the reason, in your opinion, for the misinformation, the cover-up?
I would be conjecturing, like most people, one of the great mysteries in this whole area is why the cover-ups by all the governments, but most by the United States. Other countries are starting to release those information, but in the United States, there is a deliberate attempt to hide this area, and that's probably the biggest mystery. Isn't this one? The biggest one is Roswell. Why is the Roswell incident back in 1947 enjoy a higher level of classification than our most sensitive warheads?
You're from the intelligence community. You should tell me. Well, it makes no sense. I agree.
And it's a mystery. I don't have a conjecture as to why they're doing it, but it's clear 2 presidents and 4 congressmen have been unable to crack the security that surrounds the Roswell incident. Why? That was 60 years ago. And that's the mystery. Obviously, there's all kinds of bizarre stories that have come out of that experience. But the real mystery, to me, isn't that. The real mystery is, why is it classified? Why does the government hide it? And I don't have any conjectures. I think those conjectures are just as wild as the other conjectures about the UFOs.
According to your tapes, this cover-up is very unusual because some 30 newspapers reported it in 47, and then just immediately after, what happened?
Yeah, Blanchard, the colonel of the base, when the Roswell thing first happened, issued a press release that a saucer had landed and so forth. Within a few hours, 400 miles away, the brigadier general in charge of the 8th Air Force countermanded that press release and hatched this story about it was a weather balloon and so forth. That starts a whole series of the silliest, most inane cover-up stories. There's been a sequence of them. First it was a weather balloon. Well, that didn't fly. They went one after the other. And to the community, it's almost insulting because the cover-up stories are so empty, so foolish, so ridiculous.
But what about that new technique, digital imaging?
Yeah, it's interesting that when Brigadier General Ramey made his press release countermanding Blanchard's, the press took pictures. Many years later, just a few years ago, a guy by the name of Johnson who took the picture, we were able to get the negatives, and by using advanced digital analysis of the negatives, they were able, an analyst by the name of Rudiak was able to use advanced information techniques to unravel some words that were on the memo that was in Ramey's hand. And it speaks of the victims and the disc that crashed. In other words, this
actually calls it not a plane, a disc.
A disc that crashed, and there are victims implying. See, the stories have always said there were 4 bodies, 3 were dead, 1 was still alive. That was the unconfirmed rumors that we heard. Well, it turns out that memo, that unraveling is regarded as the smoking gun because it demonstrates that the Air Force has been lying all along.
Well, these UFOs, they defy laws of physics. Your degree is in physics,
yes,
I believe.
Well, yes. The thing that is the fundamentals, we want to get right at that. I'm sorry, presuming a lot here on your audience. The UFOs have 2 problems. The one problem is they are tangible. They show up on multiple radars. They leave physical evidence, burnt ground and radioactivity and so forth. So they're tangible. They're not hallucinations. Radar sets don't have hallucinations. Okay.
Right.
On the other hand, they make right-angle turns at exotic speeds. They go faster than the speed of sound without sonic booms. They do things that seem to violate physical laws, and yet they are physical in one sense, and yet they're not physical in another. Now, the other area we need to just acknowledge is this is the toughest area to research because, not only because of all the hoaxes and all the crackpots that are in this area, is because of the deliberate disinformation by the government trying to hide these areas. But the net reality is Jacques Vallée, the Frenchman, and J. Allen Hynek, the American, are probably the 2 most of the early pioneers, the 2 most reputable researchers. They both came to the conclusion that these things are hyperdimensional. They're not extragalactical. That's a very fundamental insight, by the way, because they seem to pose to being something that they're not. But the real point is that we're dealing here with a phenomenon that bridges the physical reality we understand and a reality that's outside that. One of the things we've discovered just in the last few years is that some of the constants of physics are changing that we thought were constant. And Scientific American, in June of 2005, ran an article in which they pointed out if the constants of physics are changing, that implies that our physical reality is actually a subset, a shadow of a larger reality. And when you start dealing in the UFO area, that's one of the other demonstrations that there is a hyperdimensional aspect to this.
And you actually, from your research, believe that some of the people that report they've been abducted is actually true.
That is the spookiest side of this whole area, and probably the classic author in this area is Dr. John Mack, head of psychiatry for Harvard Hospital. He's written a book on this whole area. Clearly, and there was a conference at MIT on this whole subject. There are enormous numbers of people. Some estimates are between over 1% of the population, maybe as high as 2 or 3%, claim to have had an experience which involves being abducted by these vehicles or whatever. And now their stories are too bizarre to accept on the one hand. On the other hand, when you profile these people, they're above average intelligence, no prior psychiatric history, clearly subject to some serious trauma, and not anxious. They're almost trying to hide the stories rather than reveal them.
And their stories are similar. That's the thing that's so amazing.
They're united by some common threads. In fact, that was Mack's challenge to the conference at MIT. He says, if what these people say is happening isn't happening, what is happening? Because these stories all have common links.
I'll tell you what, hold that thought. When we come back, we're going to talk about how these UFOs tie in with end times. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Chuck, the only reason you're involved in this is it's a missing ingredient, a missing piece, something that no one looks at in the end times, these UFOs. Are these people around today, in your opinion, these descendants of the Nephilim?
I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Well, not necessarily as descendants directly, because I think that's been dealt with. I think there's, but at the same time, I do suspect that the UFOs are, in effect, a modern-day echo, if you will, and that may be what Jesus was talking about when he says, as the days of Noah were, that there's he's implying a parallelism. And so that's why we got interested in this in the first place. And if that's true, we can test it very simply, because if we're correct, these events are going to increase as we get increasingly closer to what we call the end times.
Okay, there's an allusion to this that's, I mean, it really grabbed me when you explained it on my radio show from Daniel.
Yes, oh, exactly. In Daniel chapter 2, we have the famous image of Nebuchadnezzar, and as he goes through it, the mystery is the iron mixed with clay. And when Daniel goes to explain what the miry clay is, he says, as for the miry clay, comma, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Now, I've had the exegetical experts confirm this. The they, he shifts to a personal pronoun, but the they has to be something other than the seed of men in order for them to mingle it with us. Just grammatically, it requires that. So that leads to a speculation. What are we talking about here? One of the possibilities is that we're dealing here with something that's not the seed of men, namely Nephilim, hybrids. And that's a hint there that there will be a proliferation of hybrids at the end times, because that's what Daniel's talking about. So that's a staggering verse to deal with.
You know, one of the fascinating things I find in your 2 CDs that we're making available is you talk about Joshua's assignment to destroy all the people in particular areas that a lot of people wonder about.
Yeah, when you read that as a New Testament reader, you're shocked, because God tells Joshua to wipe out every man, woman, and child of 4 key tribes. And that shocks, the New Testament reader, because we don't understand that there is a gene pool problem again. We understand Genesis 6, the flood of Noah, was dealing, among other things, with a gene pool problem in the human predicament. What we don't realize is that Satan had again laid down a minefield in Canaan, because when he found out from God's revelation to Abraham that his descendants would be away and then return after 400 years, that gave Satan 400 years to lay down a minefield. When you study the book of Judges geographically, you discover that they didn't follow through in certain areas to wipe out their instructions. The places they missed was a place called Bashan. We call that the Golan Heights today. There's other areas, the central part, that we would call Judea and Samaria, but now it's called the West Bank. And there's the third area, a place called Gaza. And you stand back from that and you realize those areas where they failed to follow through in the book of Judges are the same areas that are under dispute today. And you begin to realize that there's a demon overlay on human history here that we need to understand.
And that's my next question. In your opinion, are we talking about aliens from foreign planets, or are we talking about demons?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that even J.R. Haidt and Jacques Vallée concluded they're not intergalactical for a number of good physical reasons. We believe they're hyperdimensional, they're demonic. They also pretend to be something they're not. That means that one of their tools is deceptions. And so that gives us a perspective of where they stand biblically. I believe that they are real today and that they are demonic in their root purpose. And so that creates a danger to anyone that isn't tutored in this area, and that's one reason that we included in our materials in terms of our own spiritual hygiene. So,
well, there were over a dozen astronauts that have reported UFOs, and one astronaut in particular, his name is Dr. Edgar Mitchell. He's appealing that the files be open. Let's take a look at that.
Okay.
And what I am suggesting is it is now time to put away this embargo of truth about the alien presence. And I call upon our government to open up like other governments have, and you will hear about that this morning. Like the Belgians have, the French have, the Brazilians have, the Argentines, the Mexicans have all released their files. It's about time now that we do the same thing.
and become a part of this planetary community.
That is so amazing to me, Chuck. Are we going to open up our files or not?
And the very fact there's resistance is alarming. You'd think that if there's nothing to hide, they would open it up. So the question that really, you can only speculate, you only feed speculation the way they're operating, keeping a secret.
Okay, former President Reagan, you were telling me about an amazing, amazing statement he made about UFOs.
Well, that they may be the ingredient that it may take to get the world together. But on the presidential side, there have been 2 presidents that have tried to crack the security and couldn't, and 4 congressmen. So we need to put pressure.
What is going to happen when the President of the United States says there are UFOs, we're being invaded, there's going to be a one-world government, and, I mean, there we are, end-time prophecy.
It looks like it's very easy to see how this could have a major role in setting the stage if we understand the classical biblical scenario. And that's one reason when you go at this area, your primary study should be to understand what the Bible has said all along is the destiny of man and the history, the forward history of governments. And so, as we watch every day, that as we look at our newspaper and see where the world is going, not just in this area, the whole geopolitical horizon is converging. The more you know about your Bible, and the more you know about what's really going on in the geopolitical horizon, the more you see the convergence. We're plunging in to the climax of human history.
Based on all of your Bible study, all your research, where is America right now?
Well, America is in deep trouble. The America you and I grew up in, I believe, is over. I think that the most common question I get asked as I travel and have question and answer sessions is, where's America in prophecy? And all the end time players in eschatology are well identified in the Bible, and they're there. America's conspicuous by not being. The other question I always get asked is, why hasn't God judged America?
I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together.
Stephen Hawking is in the news tonight as one of the bona fide smart people on the planet when the renowned astrophysicist warned us about aliens from outer space this weekend. People tended to listen up. On his new Discovery Network series, Stephen Hawking says if aliens visit us here on Earth, quote, the outcome would be much as when Columbus landed in America, which didn't turn out well for the Native Americans, end of quote. Make a note, he indicates we should stay away from them at all costs.
Loud and clear. 7, go ahead. I'm talking at 10 o'clock high. This is Houston. Say again, 7. We have a bogey at 10 o'clock high.
An object which is at the same place all the time but appears to be tumbling. Well, we've had it ever since yesterday. It just seems to be tagging along with us.
October 21st, 1995.
We have an unidentified flying object.
And nothing after.
Former Air Force officers and an investigator are here with their stories. Here in Los Angeles is Robert Hastings. He's author of UFOs and Nukes. Alice is a former captain, U.S. Air Force Base. Former U.S. Air Force officer. He was at Maelstrom as well in 1967, and he says his superiors told him UFOs caused the malfunctions. And in Peoria, Illinois is Dr. Bob Jacobs, former First Lieutenant, U.S. Air Force, former U.S. Air Force photographic instrumentation officer. A UFO showed up on film that he shot in 1964 at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and that was later confiscated by CIA. Hastings, how did you get, what's your explanation for UFOs at nuclear weapon sites?
I can simply say after 35 years of research that these incidents have taken place. There are hundreds of declassified documents which indicate that UFOs have demonstrated a distinct and ongoing interest in our nuclear weapons sites. I've also interviewed nearly 100 gentlemen who were involved in these incidents at various Air Force bases. This is very widespread. What you're seeing here this evening is the tip of the iceberg.
How do they cause a malfunction? What do they do to cause something to not work?
I think that's probably still an unknown. I know that Boeing engineers attempted to duplicate some of the malfunctions. They did succeed in doing that, but they still can't determine what initially caused them. Bob Salas could address that.
Bob, what happened at Maelstrom in 1967?
1967, I was on duty as a missile launch officer. I get calls from my guards upstairs. First, I get one call saying that they're seeing strange lights flying in the sky, and I didn't pay too much attention to that. About 5 minutes later, the main security guard, the flight security controller, calls down, says he's looking at a glowing red object, very large, hovering over the front gate. He wants to know what to do. I tell him to secure the facility. We hang up. I go to tell my commanders. So within seconds of that call, my missiles start shutting down. I recall losing all 10 of them.
You didn't see the object?
I didn't see the object because I was obliged to stay underground in the capsule.
By shutting down, we mean what?
By shutting down, what I mean is they were not launchable. They were in a no-go condition, disabled.
How long to restart them?
How long to restart? Well, I'm sure it took over a day, and maybe...
All right. Now, Bob Jamison, you were there too, right?
Yes, sir.
And you were in the Air Force?
Yes, I was in the Air Force.
Where were you when this was happening?
I was a targeting officer, missile targeting officer. I was at home relaxing, and I got a call from Job Control to tell them to come in. A missile had gone down. My job as a targeting officer was to bring him back up. And so I went into...
So you didn't see the incident, you just went to the missile?
I went to the incident. I went to the site.
Where is Maelstrom?
It's Great Falls, Montana, just outside of Great Falls, Montana.
What did you make of the story?
Well, I know that it's true. I went into Job Control after I got to the hangar. I was called in, went to the hangar, went to the Job Control, and I noticed they have a map of the whole complex with green lights where the missiles were good, but there's one small area with 10 red lights. I mean, those missiles were out.
Is it possible they just malfunctioned?
That doesn't happen. Very rarely does a missile malfunction, and I don't think much more rare would be 2 at the same time, but never 10.
Bob Jacobs, where were you? What were you filming, and where were you?
I was officer in charge of optical instrumentation at Vandenberg Air Force Base from 1963 to 66.
That's
Our job was
California?
to photograph. That's California, so right down the coast.
Right.
And our job was to photograph with high-speed instrumentation every missile launch from Vandenberg going down the test range. They wanted to find out if we could figure out a place to put a telescope where we could get a side view of the missile so that we could see all 3 stages of powered flight. So I went up to Big Sur, California, up on a U.S. Forest Service road on Anderson Peak, and I installed a telescopic sight up there. The Air Force flew in a huge catadioptric telescope from the Cape. It was built by Dr. Walter Manning at the Boston University. They put the telescope up there, and with that thing, which had a focal length of 2,500 inches, we photographed an Atlas missile raising up out of the fog cover and flying down range. We got all 3 stages of powered flight, and as the dummy warhead and the package flew on down range, we were all celebrating the fact that we had seen the thing and accomplished the mission. When I got back to the base with the film the next day, I was called into the office of Major Florence J. Mansman, and there were 3 people in gray suits standing in there. There was a 16-millimeter camera and a screen set up. Major Mansman said, "Lieutenant, sit down and watch this." And he turned down the lights, turned on the camera, on the projector, and the film came on. And I recognized it as the film that we'd shot at Big Sur the previous day. Toward the end of the flight, I was looking at Major Mansman saying, "Pretty good stuff, huh, sir?" And suddenly he said, "Just watch this." And as I watched, the warhead, the dummy warhead, the chaff that was put out in front of it as a decoy to deflect the Russian anti-missile tracking radar. Everything was flying along, and suddenly, in the same direction this stuff was flying at about 8,000 miles an hour, an object came into the frame, shot a beam of light at the warhead, flew up to the top, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew around the direction it was flying, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew down, shot another beam of light at the warhead, and flew out the same way it came in.
The U.S. government does not obviously appreciate people such as myself and these gentlemen speaking out about this. What we're describing on an ongoing basis, decade after decade, at multiple Air Force bases, is disruption of our nuclear missiles.
We have an email from Kyle in Plainville, Massachusetts. Why would UFOs only disable U.S. defense systems and not another country? Is there a lesson to be learned in all this? Or do you think maybe, Bob Salas, they have disabled other countries?
They have. I know that there have been events in the Soviet Union where they have interfered there. They've been seen in just any country you can name, and they do disable communications, especially.
We have an email from Eric in Atlanta, Georgia. What can be done, if anything, to force the U.S. government and/or military to declassify and release all it knows about UFOs? Dr. Jacobs, when do you think that would happen? Do you think that would happen?
It would take a revolution in public opinion. The problem with this field is that it's surrounded by so many crackpots and weirdos who make a joke about it, that those of us who take it seriously and think that something is definitely going on that needs to be scientifically investigated are laughed at. The technician here in the studio where I am, I said we were talking about UFOs tonight, and her face lit up and she got that kind of look, which is typical of what happens to us. I think that we need a real scientific committee to be put together to look into these things. I think Robert would agree this too.
Absolutely.
Bob Salas, you agree?
Yeah, I would like to make a comment real quick. The Air Force has perpetrated a fraud, especially in our case. They claimed in their statement about UFOs that no UFO incident has ever affected national security, and we lost 20 missiles during the Cold War. They also stonewalled the Condon Committee at that time. The Condon Committee had heard about our incident and were told to go away. They said they were told that no UFOs were involved. And then the Air Force turns around and uses the Condon Committee as a reason not to further investigate UFOs.
Well, let's get to the real core of all of this. What's the biblical view? And we're going to talk a little bit about the days of Noah. You know, Jesus gave 4 disciples a confidential briefing on his second coming. And the 4 disciples came to him to inquire of his return, and he detailed the precedent events that would occur prior to his second coming. And his answer to them, these 4 guys, is so important it's recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21 and 22. But he opens and closes that briefing with a repeated admonition. Take heed that no man deceive you. And that occurs in Matthew 24:4, and you'll find it's the theme of the entire presentation. We're dealing here in spiritual matters, and the attempt of the enemy will be to deceive us. But in the middle of this briefing, about verse 37 of Matthew 24, Jesus makes a very strange remark. He says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now in the context there, what he may have been alluding to is simply that it'll be business as usual until, just as it was business as usual until Noah and the ark, it'll be business as usual until he returns. And most people who read that passage assume that that's all he meant. It's just that it's going to come as a surprise. And yet there are many scholars from the context of the details of that passage feel he was giving us a hint of something deeper. And we really won't understand what he's talking about unless we understand what the days of Noah were like. And so we're going to try to figure out what did Jesus really mean. As the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So what you really need to do to get a handle on the UFO thing, strangely enough, is to do your homework in Genesis chapter 6. And I want you to notice the first two verses, and I want you to pay attention that the first two verses are a single sentence. Many people stumble because they don't realize it's a single sentence. I'll just see what I'm getting at in a minute. Genesis 6, verse 1. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the Benai Elohim, the sons of God, as it's translated, saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. One verse. Now the question is, this strange phrase, sons of God, that can mean anything to us. Let's find out what the text really means, sons of God. What it is in the Hebrew is, remember Hebrew goes from right to left, so if you're watching the slides here, remember all languages go towards Jerusalem. Now, sons of God, Benai Elohim, is a term that's always used of a direct creation of God. Adam was a direct creation of God. You and I, in the natural, are not. We're sons of Adam. That's our problem. That's what the book of Romans is all about. And but as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God. The term has technical meaning in the New Testament as well as the Old. In the Old Testament, this term in the Hebrew, in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, Job 38:7, is always used of angels, because they are a direct creation of God. In the New Testament, also Luke 20:36. Also the book of Enoch. Now, don't misunderstand my use of this as a citation here. The book of Enoch was very popular from about the 2nd century before Christ to the 2nd century after. It is not an inspired book. I wouldn't treat it that way. But it is useful in understanding the vocabulary and the grammar of the time. And clearly the book of Enoch, this term is used there also to refer to angels, and it deals with it greatly. The Septuagint, this is the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures that went from Hebrew to Greek. If you were a Jew living in the time of say, the 2nd century before Christ, the enforced language worldwide, the commercial language, was Greek. Thanks to Alexander the Great and following, that was the common language. If you were a Jew in business anywhere in the world, you had to speak Greek to survive. You may have known Hebrew for religious purposes, but Hebrew was to the Jew in those days what Latin is to a Catholic today, basically a language for religious purposes. So one of the things, if you were Jewish in those days, what you would have liked to have had is a copy of what we call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, in Greek, so you could read it. And because of that, under Ptolemy Philadelphus, he funded the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, started about 285 BC, finished about 270 BC, and the result of that work product, he got 70 of the top scholars. The word Septuagint is just 70, fancy word for Greek word for 70. He got the 70 top scholars to do the translation. It took about 15 years. And the result of that we have copies of. And it's known as the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. And it gives us the benefit of the precision of Greek on some of these issues.
So it's a very, very powerful resource for scholars. And the Septuagint also makes it clear that we're dealing here with angels, as we think of them. Now in Genesis 6, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all whom they chose. The word sons of God, of course, is Benai Ha Elohim, sons of God, direct creation, term for angels. Saw the daughters of men. Now by the way, what that really says in the Hebrew is Banaf Adam, daughters of Adam. I mention this because there have been contrived some strange interpretations of this passage that are commonly taught in most seminaries. And it's tragic because there's a view of this passage that has no scriptural support. And we'll talk about that because you'll run into it. Many people think that this is strange stuff, and it is strange. It's even stranger than most people realize. So, now when you get down to verse 4 of Genesis 6, it says, there were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. What this verse seems to indicate is that these Nephilim were offspring of a strange union. The sons of God, these are angels according to the Hebrew precision here. They came in unto the daughters of men. Daughters of Adam, incidentally. This is not just Cain and Seth and any of that. This is the daughter. These are daughters of men. And they bear children to them. It's those children that are the Nephilim. Now what on earth is the Nephilim? That word, Nephilim, is a key word. We're going to talk a lot about that. Nephilim means the fallen ones. It comes from the verb nephal, which means to fall, be cast down, to fall away, to desert. That's what a Nephilim is, a deserter, in a sense. What the passage portrays, and it's very difficult for many people to absorb this, it portrays fallen angels. These are not the good guys. Remember when Satan fell, a third of the angels fell with him. Not all of them, but a group of them, apparently, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, chose to try to create a hybrid race. By I don't know the technology. I'm not going to get into that. But they apparently were... See, angels can't multiply. Angels are eternal. Reproduction is a process for mortals. But at the same time, Satan's got a problem. A third of the angels fell with him, so he's got a deficiency of 2 to 1 in any war that comes in, right? He's got to find a way to strengthen himself. This is just a conjecture that floats around. Now the offspring of Nephilim, they're also called the Hagibarim, the mighty ones. And now where the confusion starts to set in is when this Hebrew passage was translated into the Greek in the Septuagint, the word they used for the Nephilim was gigantes. It sounds like giants. And it turns out they were giants, but that's not what the word means. Gigantes comes from gigas, which means earthborn. So in the Hebrew, they're called the fallen ones. In the Greek, they're called the earthborn. And so let's keep that in mind. The fact that they were giants is like a pun. Yes, they were giants, but that's not what the word means. It carries a different meaning. Let's go on a little further in verse 9 of Genesis 6. It says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Terrific verse. We've all read it. But most of us may not pay attention to what that's really saying. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. What does that mean? Well, the word perfect in the Hebrew is tamim. What it means is without blemish, sound, healthful, without spot, unimpaired. What that verse seems to indicate is that Noah's genealogy was unblemished. Now this comes on right after the verses that talk about these strange goings-on, where these fallen angels have created some weird form of hybrid, but Noah was unblemished in his generations, and that's one of the reasons that God chose Noah and his 3 sons and their 4 wives to start over again. The purpose of the flood was not just that there was sin in the land. There was, and that's emphasized. But if sin brings the flood, we better get some life jackets. No, there's something far deeper going on. That's what I want to sensitize you for when you do your own study and come to your own conclusions. But I want you to recognize there's something much more profound that God, as a problem that God was solving, and that is that Satan's strategy was to contaminate the human race. Now, by the way, if this view is correct, I'm presenting to you what's sometimes called the angel view of Genesis 6. That is not taught in most seminaries, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But if that view is correct, as I've suggested from the exegesis of the Hebrew in Genesis 6, it will be confirmed in the New Testament, at least twice, and it is. When you get to the book of Jude, Jude makes an allusion to this very event in Jude verses 6 and 7. Jude is just one chapter, but in verses 6 and 7, Jude writes, "And the angels," and by the way, this is in the Greek, so it's not ambiguous, "and the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of that great day, even as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities about them in like manner giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." Jude is talking about judgment on the bad guys. And he mentions among these things, these angels which sinned back in Genesis 6. These angels kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains. These angels that participated in Genesis 6 apparently are chained, awaiting a special judgment. We'll talk. Peter's going to talk about that in a minute. And Jude adds something else here. He makes a comparison between the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah and the sins of these angels, in that they were doing that which is unnatural. Sodom and Gomorrah, homosexuality. We're all familiar with that. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. He's using that as an additional exemplar, lumping the angels with him. The angels that went after strange flesh, so did Sodom and Gomorrah. They're both reserved for special judgment. You follow me? You can read it, check it out yourself. That's one confirmation. That's in Jude. Let's take a look at see, they left their own habitation. We're going to come back to that in a minute. And going after strange flesh is the allusion here. Let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. 2 Peter. In Peter's second letter, he says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus," it's translated hell in your English Bible, but the Greek word is Tartarus. It's the only place that word appears in the Bible. I'll come back to that. "If God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah," and he goes on. So Peter does a couple of things here. He again alludes to the angels that sinned. They're cast into Tartarus. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And they're reserved for a final judgment. "And spared not the old world, but saved Noah." In other words, he ties that event to the days of Noah. So he not only confirms Genesis 6, but he also links it to the days of Noah. Okay. The word Tartarus deserves some comment. The problem with this word is it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible, but it does appear in Greek literature. It's the Greek term for the dark abode of woe. It is the pit of darkness in the unseen world. It shows up, for example, in Homer's Iliad, where Tartarus is as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. So where's Tartarus? I don't know, and I don't want to find out. So Tartarus was a term for a deep, special. It was regarded as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. So it's where these angels are chained until the final thing. Now, if you study classic Greek mythology, you run into the Titans. These creatures in the legends and the myths were partly terrestrial and partly celestial. They rebelled against their father Uranus, and after a prolonged contest were defeated by Zeus and condemned where? Into Tartarus. Do you see a parallel brewing here? I'm going to suggest to you that the legends of the ancient Greeks embody the truth of what really happened in the past, that there were these strange creatures generating hybrids that the Greek called Titans. And we see Zeus in many forms. We see Atlas and Hercules, Atlas and Hercules from Greek mythology were what would be called in the Hebrew Nephilim, offspring of an intermarriage between a god and a woman. And so, now these legends we obviously see in the Sumer culture, in Assyria, in Egypt. I'll show you a few things. In the Incas, the Mayan, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Persian mythology, and certainly in the Greek mythology, which most of us as products of Western civilization are familiar with. Also in India, Bolivia, South Sea Islands. Every one of these cultures, and the American Indians, every one of these cultures have legends of the star people. These people that came, these gods or demigods, whatever, came and cohabited with women and produced hybrids. I discover from some apparent experts in the American Indian culture that this business of holding a hand up saying how, that's Hollywood. But what apparently was the practice when they met a stranger was to hold up the hand so they could count fingers. They had a terror of the six-fingered people. And if you go to the ruins at Chaca, New Mexico, they have one of the exhibits there that you want to take a look at, the famous pictographs. And among those pictographs you'll find the fearsome six-fingered hand as part of that. I came across something else that's kind of... The Pawnee Indians have an account that Bill... You remember Buffalo Bill? Real name was William Cody. He wrote his autobiography in 1920. Very colorful guy. You can get his book. It's popular. But there's an interesting quote in his book by Buffalo Bill Cody, published in 1920. He says, while we were in the Sandhills scouting the Niobrara country, the Pawnee Indians brought into camp some very large bones, one of which the surgeon of the expedition pronounced to be the thigh bone of a human being. The Indians said the bones were those of a race of people who long ago had lived in that country. They said these people were 3 times the size of a man of the present day. And they were so swift and strong that they could run by the side of a buffalo and taking the animal in one arm could tear off a leg and eat it as they ran. I don't know what to make of that. It's in his autobiography. It's published in 1920. I don't think he was worried about UFOs and stuff, but it is a interesting allusion to the Indian legends. In the early country, Ashur, they always speak of the flying god of Ashur. And this diagram you see in many of the ancient monuments of a man with a bow, like Nimrod perhaps, and the wings. And you see this on the monuments. Here's an example of them. As you go through Egypt, this is a snapshot in one of the tombs of, I think it's Ramesses II, but you see in all of them. You'll notice on the headers of these passages, again you see a flying disc again and again and again as you go through Egypt. You look at the headers on many of these monuments. You look up there and you always see the flying disc, sometimes with a snake involved. And you see it again and again and again. Sometimes you see a person involved with these, and you even find the disc being transported from place to place. So this seems to be something more than simply a symbol of some icon that they're worshiping. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of angels, because that's really at the root of this problem. You notice we learn a lot about angels by looking at the Bible. They always appear in human form. They look human. In fact, many people entertain them unawares, we find out. Sodom and Gomorrah, the homosexuals were after them. That tells you something. I don't want to be too graphic here. And at the resurrection and at the ascension, there's always a pair of angels. And they're like men. They look like men standing there. They spoke. They took men by the hand. They ate meals with them. They're capable of direct physical combat. The Passover in Egypt was by a death angel. In the book of 2 Kings, slaughter of the 185,000 Syrians. One angel after night slaughters 185,000 Syrians. You don't mess around with angels. Now, and they don't marry in heaven. Now that's a phrase. By the way, I'm making a contrast here. With the demons of the New Testament are not like this. They apparently are powerless except to the extent they can embody some person. They're not like angels. Don't distinguish between fallen angels, the bad guys, and the demons.
The demons apparently are disembodied spirits looking for embodiment. Angels don't have that problem. They apparently can materialize all the way through the Scripture. We see them that way. We do know they don't marry. The question that everybody has, can angels have sex? The Scripture says no. No, it doesn't say that. Jesus says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God. He's talking about that in a resurrection bodies we don't have sex because we're immortal. There is no procreation. There is no reproduction issue. And angels, he's talking here about the angels of God in heaven. I would not speculate on the technologies available to an angel who falls. And that's what we're dealing with here. Now there's a strange word that gets overlooked by the scholars in general, and I've participated in some translation issues on this very issue. There's a word called okaterion, and it refers to the body as the dwelling place for the spirit. It only occurs twice in the Scripture, and it's very interesting where it does. It occurs in Jude 6, and it's the word that describes what the fallen angels disrobed from. And in 2 Corinthians 5:2, it speaks of, it alludes to the heavenly body that you and I, as believers, aspire to be clothed in. Same word, okay. I think it's a technical term that's overlooked by the scholars. In Jude 6 and 7, it says, when the angels which kept not their first estate left their own habitation. That word habitation is okaterion. They disrobed from the body that they were given to indulge in this mischief in Genesis 6. The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness in the judgment of that great day. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and so on, we went through that before. The word is okaterion. In 2 Corinthians 5, 1 and 2, Paul tells the Corinthians, for we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And for this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven. The word translated house is okaterion. That which those angels abandoned is what we aspire to. That kind of a habit, if you will. Okaterion again. Anyway, let's talk about something else we talked about earlier and mentioned earlier. We should get into alien abductions. You know, the disturbing thing is there's continuing a deluge of cases being reported that are too weird, too bizarre to take seriously on the one hand, but they're too frequent and too consistent to ignore. And estimates of 1 to 3% of our population have been reported in the professional journals. All the strange episodes seem to involve the implanting or the harvesting of human fetuses as a primary topic. It seems that if these creatures are real, they're very preoccupied with the human reproductive process. And that causes us to wonder, could this be leading to a repetition of the strange events of Genesis 6? Is it possible that this is the hint that is included in Jesus' remark, as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming Son of Man be? Dr. John Max, a Pulitzer Prize-winning MD, he head of psychiatry for Harvard's hospital there, and he's written on this area. He says, the idea that men and women and children can be taken against their wills from their homes, cars, or schoolyards by strange humanoid beings, lifted into spacecraft, and subjected to intrusive and threatening procedures is so terrifying and yet so shattering to our notions of what is possible in our universe that the actuality of the phenomenon has been largely rejected out of hand or bizarrely distorted in most media accounts. This is altogether understandable given the disturbing nature of UFO abductions and our prevailing notions about reality. The fact remains, however, that for 30 years and possibly longer, thousands of individuals who seem to be sincere and of sound mind and who are seeking no personal benefit from their stories have been providing to those who will listen consistent reports of precisely such events. By the way, John Mack has personally dealt with 76 cases himself. He's profiled others. These are people above average intelligence with no prior psychiatric history that clearly are subject to some kind of trauma. And there was a conference on this abduction phenomenon at MIT. And John Mack was one of the co-chairmen of that conference. And he says, if what these abductees are saying is happening to them isn't happening, what is? Saying, what's really going on here? Here's Mac's challenge to the professionals that were there assembled. The high degree of consistency of the stories, the absence of any prior psychiatric illness, physical changes in lesions. Some of these people have scars from the procedures, and I've encountered one myself on that. Independently witnessed by others while the abductions are taking place. There's not many, but there are a few. The involvement of small children is disturbing. Not likely they could be conditioned by, Well, let's move on. The coming to cosmic deception, what's the biggest lie of all? It's interesting. This all started back in Satan. He says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and he shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And from this verse we get one of the messianic titles of Christ, the seed of the woman. What many people overlook, there's two seeds mentioned here. The other seed is the seed of the serpent. And so we have the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And the seed of the serpent, we find all kinds of idioms, the red dragon in Revelation 12, the coming world leader, as I sometimes call him, the false prophet in Revelation 13. These forces are still at work and behind the world powers today. Check out Daniel 10 and really understand what's going on there. All of us have studied Daniel 2 and the sequence of nations, or empires I should say, that were re-echoed in Daniel 7, the winged lion, bear on one side, the leopard, the terrible beast, the 10 heads. Again, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome 1 and 2. We've been through that in our prophetic studies, and most people recognize the iron mixed with clay is the Roman Empire. Don't confuse that with Western Europe. The Roman Empire, part 1 and part 2. Well, we live in a world, what's going on in this world? There's a new world order. A world without borders is the concept. The end of the independent nation state. Multiculturalism is in. Check your faith at the door. We're going to all compromise. And this is all heading for a centralized socialistic government. And there are a couple of forcing functions. Every freedom-loving person considers this an anathema, except the problem is there's no way to avoid it. Nuclear proliferation is part of it. We're on the threshold right now of nuclear war because of this very issue. But there's another forcing function that nobody talks about. The possibility, ultimately, not yet, but coming, of a cosmic threat of some kind. You say, Chuck, that's way out. That's fringe stuff. Really? Let's talk about the miry clay. In Daniel's famous vision of the multi-metal image, the last phase was, of course, the iron mixed with clay, the 10 toes. What is miry clay? Miry clay is clay made from mire, or dust, if you will. And everybody talks about the clay in the 10 toes of Daniel's imagery. No one, I'm guilty too, paid any attention to Daniel's explanation of it. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 43, he's explaining the whole thing. He's interpreting this vision for you. When he gets to this, in verse 43, he says, Whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another, and so on. That phrase, I read that 100 times over the last 30 years and didn't hit me until this in-depth study. The miry clay refers to a they. It's a personal pronoun. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. In order to mingle themselves with the seed of men, they have to be something other than the seed of men. Or it makes no grammatical or logical sense. So the they that are going to do the mingling are not the seed of men. Oh, could this be a hint of some mischief in the end times analogous to the mischief in Genesis 6? I think so. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Boy, there it stares at me. Well, speaking of UFOs in the end times, I remember Walter Martin. I was on his board for many years. My partner and I were the guys that brought him to the West Coast. And we because of his very, very critical ministry to comparative religions, we tried to keep him off this subject because we felt it would discredit his ministry. I don't hesitate these days for two reasons. One is I've got nothing to lose. My ministry is probably discredited anyway. But also times are a little more lucid these days. But in any case, I can remember Walter, using any excuse, he would get to Luke 21:26. And he'd quote this, men's heart failing them for fear, and looking after those things which are coming upon the earth. And whenever he did it, he always gestured with his hand. Men's hearts failing themselves for fear, and looking after those things which are coming upon the earth. And he'd make sort of an inverted saucer with his hand as it was landing. He'd say, coming, and he'd just gesture with it. He saw UFOs here. And for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And I'm not to say he's wrong, but we used to always smile. Walter, get off that subject. Anyway, but the coming great deception, Jesus opens and closes his Matthew 24 thing. He says, there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders. Insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. What's going to protect you? Your intellectual background? Your knowledge of physics? No way. No way. If it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. The only thing that can save you from this deception is your spiritual condition by being in Christ. They shall show great signs and wonders. They're going to do things that are going to violate our apparent knowledge of reality. We get to 2 Thessalonians, Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2 says a lot to say about this. He says, the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now hindereth will hinder until he be taken out of the way. And then shall the wicked one be revealed, whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders. The wicked one is going to do miracles. Be prepared for some political leader to raise people from the dead. We're not ready for that. The mystery, see, I think the restrainer is restraining far more than you and I have any idea. More than we have capacity to imagine. I think after the rapture, it's going to get so strange, it's going to be way out there. Now, where does this wicked one come from? It surprises many to realize the Scripture tells us. In Revelation 11 and Revelation 17. Revelation 11, verse 7, and when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. Where is this guy coming from? From out of the abuso. So he's not just some political leader that happens to be kind of gifted. No, this guy is empowered by Satan himself. And he's coming out of the abuso himself. You get to Revelation 17. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, go into perdition, and they that dwell upon the earth shall wonder whose names are not written in the book of life. The only thing that can protect you from all of this is your position in Christ. 2 Thessalonians goes on, and because they received not the love of the truth that they might be saved, for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. Don't assume that you can get saved after the rapture. People will be saved after the rapture. But if you've had an opportunity and turned down the redemption of Christ, this is what it's talking about. Because they received not the love of the truth that they might be saved, and for this cause God will send them a strong delusion that they should believe the lie. Be careful. Don't play that game. If you're going to accept Christ, do it now. Don't wait, or you'll be vulnerable to the big deception. Now, the most absurd war is coming. I always fasten with Psalm 2, which is a dialogue among the Trinity. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. And it goes on. This whole idea that the world is going to take up arms against God Himself astonishes me. I can understand people not believing God or rejecting God. Yes, I can't imagine going after Him warfare. It just doesn't make sense. Why would the world go after? I think the Nephilim thing will explain it. You know, it's interesting that the alien types. If you read you wallow through all this literature. Dr. Mark Eastman and I spent a lot of time going through that stuff. You'll discover there's three types of these so-called alien creatures that emerge. The Greys, those are the diminutives, short, you always see them in the entertainment media. There's another group that seem to appear, that's sometimes called the Nordics or the Pleiadians. They're about 6 foot tall, they're blonde, blue-eyed, they look like people. Could be around us now. And there's a third group that are the most grotesque of them all, but they're sometimes called the reptilians. These are scaly, weird creatures that look like a refuge from some grade B science fiction movie. There's weird stuff. Well, these three always show up. It's interesting, in Revelation 16, verse 13, 14, I've always wondered, how does the world go to war against God? And John tells us, I saw 3 unclean spirits like what? Like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. I think God is going to use some kind of strange creatures, demonic or whatever, to draw the world into this confrontation that is part of the climax that Revelation and the Old Testament deal with.